For today's podcast is going to be on this will be on Article 2 of the Constitution, but before we get to that, I'd like to ask people to consider donating to my Patreon page at www.patreon.com/challengehistory. It goes from $1 all the way up to $100 a month in different increments of $1, $10, $25, $50, and $100. Obviously, you can donate any more than that. That would be greatly appreciated. It gives a little backstory of me and the whole thing behind what the monies really go towards. And it helps me. I'm currently on disability, and a little bit more about what's really going on in my life, and this can really help for both me and the channel. Basically, in the future with it will kind of expand to what this will offer people. I'll verbally explain with it on this. The reason why, when it comes down to it, why it only shows when you view these, why it only shows a one-time bonus is because I'm not currently offering any true bonus at this time. But there will be, when people start to add in, that I will be giving away different things, and at that time I will try to contact the individuals and notify them. Especially with it, I hope that they're also subscribers on my YouTube page. That makes it a lot easier to notify them and tell them about the winning of any types of prizes or anything that are going to be added on at a later date. Well, then that's about it on that part. I'd like to get to the actual meat and potatoes of this actual thing, why everybody's probably looking at this video, which will be the actual thing on Article 2 of the Constitution. Now, this on Section 1, basically, what we're looking at is the actual function of how people actually get to be president. In this case, with it, the major part is, you're going to notice on this part is you're going to see on how the actual division of the electors comes up. Obviously, that gets a little more broken down when we come to the idea of the amendments themselves. But when we come down to that, is it'll basically show that it's actually for actual people, and it's based on the number of senators and representatives from each state. Obviously, those representatives for those will be based on population of the state, so it's based on roughly a popular vote per state. Senators are based on essentially creating an equal representation per state, so it doesn't disenfranchise the actual individual. And the reason why they've created this system is to create a balance. And now we could actually, now at the time with it, they actually use individuals to be electors for this, for electing the president. But in the modern day, we could actually use a computerized system to tally out the votes and use it that way to essentially eliminate the actual difficulty of it and create the end process of it. In that way, we could also use a better division process to essentially create a system to where functions better for the individual by breaking it down even further by county. for each vote, even more so than the actual representatives, because sometimes representatives cross over by each realm with it, and or actually make not by counting, but I make it make the points by where each candidate does not get an at-large point for the state, but where each of these points are divvied up for the state, such as in a case where you find certain states that will divvy up the points based on a candidate, but where we actually essentially eliminate the idea of one candidate getting all the points based on essentially gaining essentially a popular vote for throughout the state. Now, if we essentially eliminate that and say, well, we're going to create a system to where you can get the 2 at-large points for the senators, and the rest of the points dependent on population could be between 1 and dependent on the max for your states. Obviously, California having the most with it, but basically between 1 and, since this number is essentially has not necessarily been created for the future elections, but as we're looking for census data that could actually impact elections, you're talking, I believe it's 52 is for what California has currently, so that would be the highest level, and those 52 would essentially be the highest number that could be divided amongst whoever won those regions. Now, this essentially empowers third-party candidates, as well as makes your major 2 parties actually have to work for each of those regions. It empowers third-party candidates because they can essentially attack certain regions that they believe are vulnerable, and this is something that would make it quite interesting, and would still stay within the electoral system. Now, what the current problem is that when people state they want to go to a popular vote, and that this is something that we're still talking about within Section 1, is the idea of electing a president within a popular vote. Now, a popular vote goes down to the idea that the majority are essentially voting over the minority. Now, if you understand that we are not a direct democracy, we're actually a representative republic, which is completely different, you would understand that this is not even anywhere close to being constitutional. Even if certain states were to even try to tie their electoral votes to the idea of a popular vote, that might not even be viewed as constitutional, as certain states are trying to do this. This might be essentially might be challenged in the courts as not being constitutional for the rights of the minority, because of the way it actually impacts. Because essentially you're stealing, depending on how the way the state goes, you could essentially be stealing the vote away from those people. And if it doesn't go the way that the state traditionally would vote, essentially you are stealing those votes away. Now, these people are essentially trying to sway it to being linked to the popular vote, which essentially is linking them to where their vote doesn't matter, and it doesn't necessarily mean that their vote essentially is going to be lining up with what the popular vote would essentially be. If essentially their vote totals could be completely different, and this is why we would why essentially you would essentially be discounting such votes from these states. One of the states is Colorado. So if Colorado voted in one such way, let's assume that they're going to keep the current system, and if they're voting essentially on the person who does not win the popular vote, completely one-sided, and let's say 60% to 40%, so it's really one-sided. Now you're essentially telling the people of Colorado that their votes don't matter, that you're basically going to burn every one of their votes, that essentially that their opinions don't matter, that you're going to throw every one of their opinions out, and you're going to say that basically whatever the nation decides you're going to go with. Now this is this would essentially be completely unconstitutional, because essentially you're violating the rights of the individuals to essentially have some type of representation. And that's essentially what would be happening. That's why these ideas come through. And such an idea would actually be thrown out. Now when we start to look at other parts that are a little bit key, is you're going to find that he does take an actual very, very big oath that is very, very important. He says, "I do solemnly swear," or he can say, or affirm, that I will faithfully execute the office of the President of the United States, and will to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. This means that basically is they cannot violate the Constitution under this oath. This is why when we put people under within the idea of putting them in the judicial, the legislative, or the executive branches, violations of this essentially is a violation of their oath. So whenever they violate the Constitution, it's not just breaking a rule book, it's violating the oath that they are meant to uphold. And that's something major. And that should be essentially leading to removal of office. Now the problem being is it doesn't always happen. Now while the executive is usually more focused on this point, we tend to ignore the points of what happens in the legislative. And when I've pointed out a lot online is that when we look at some of these people, is that we're talking less than 5% of the people in the legislative branch actually follow the Constitution. And when it's that low, we're talking that the rest of them should actually be completely thrown out of office because they can't even uphold the oath that they actually swore to keep. Now in Section 2, it's basically reiterating the basic role that they're taking, such as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy and of the militia of several states when called into actual service for the United States. Basically, those are that's through being voluntary and asking them as well. He may inquire opinion in writing of the principal officer of each of the executive departments, and so the related duty of the respective offices, and he shall power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. So if he ain't being impeached, or these other individuals are not being impeached, he is free to grant reprieves and pardons, and those are not considered impeachable offenses. Doesn't matter if it's an investigation in anything. That means if he were to grant pardons or reprieves for anybody involving when we're talking about Trump here, involving the Mueller investigation, he can grant pardons to every individual involving that investigation. And it doesn't matter, because the fact is if he were to grant pardons for every one of them, and it wouldn't matter, because the fact is he is not being impeached, nor are any of those other individuals being impeached, because most of them are not political officials. He shall have the power bind with the advice and consent to make treaties, provide 2/3 of the senators present concur. He shall nominate and with by advice and consent shall appoint ambassadors, other public ministers and councils, judges of the Supreme Court, and other offices. Basically, uses other roles of basic appointment. And the president shall have the power to fill up vacancies during recesses of Senate, and this is where he cannot declare recesses like Obama tried to state that the Senate was in recess, and Obama got into a lot of trouble with this one. Section 3 is basically he can force both houses to convene in case of a disagreement to basically come together to some type of agreement on certain issues. Section 4 just covers on the idea of basically the president, vice president, all other civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. Now, this is basically the standard of what we actually deal with when we're talking about the impeachment and removal. And this is what you would have to prove. Now, high crimes and misdemeanors tends to be a very, very vague term. This is usually where they tend to go after people in more modern impeachment trials, because this is a very, very vague term, and this is where they like to use the actual thing of how to go after people, because you can either use you can use it as a political term, or you can go after people for, again, when we go up to this top thing, which is on the idea of that oath. When we go out to the idea of the oath, going right here is not upholding that oath. Now, mind you, that they'll try to hold that against them, even though the legislature themselves, we're talking over 95% of them, are not doing that themselves. Now, they love to hold that above the president, even though they're not actually doing it themselves, which is quite hilarious. Now, traditionally, you're not going to find cases of treason and bribery, because in those cases, you're talking traditionally, it's going to be very difficult to bribe a president, because there's really nothing you can really offer them. In the case of Donald Trump, what are you going to bribe him with? When you have a person with a personal value of basically 10 figures, it's not going to be very easy to bribe them. So it's not really reasonable to do that. Even if we're going to say it's upper 9 figures, we're talking that's more money than anybody would ever need. What other amount of money do you need? So there's nothing theoretically that they can bribe them with. The other theory on that would be is they try to say that, they have dirt on them. Well, frankly, nothing's been proven on that. Even on their salacious dossier, that's been proven to be completely false, and the source of that dossier that actually printed it was actually more known for actually producing pictures of cats. So when it looks like your actual source with it, they're the ones who actually printed it out there, and the people who were actually involved was, you had one British agent that essentially had hatred of Trump to begin with, and had hatred of Russia for gaining the actual World Cup games, which is essentially when you have and essentially that led to him wanting to produce these things again, because it would essentially make Russia look poor and would make Trump look poor, so thus he wanted to produce it. You had a lot of Never Trumper people from the neoconservative realms produce this that end up backing Hillary Clinton. You had the Democrats that were backing Hillary Clinton produce back this. You had people that were perpetual bureaucrats push this as actual legitimate intelligence. So when we start looking at this, we can see that there was no case for bribery. And when we go to treason, the idea of treason is essentially doing something to essentially work against your own country's interest deliberately. Now, this is almost impossible to prove. You would essentially need some case to where it would have to be very, very obvious. Now, there's usually there would have to be some type of actual legitimate evidence on it. Now, most of the time, it's just it would just be hearsay, and that's why they tend to avoid tossing that out there, in which there would be no evidence of treason, with the exception of basically John Brennan trying to toss that out there when he's essentially acted against the interests of the United States himself by trying to spy on the Senate themselves, because he didn't like what they were discussing, which is essentially would technically can be considered as an impeachable offense, because essentially you are engaging in high crimes and misdemeanors right there. That is an illegal act. He also lied on several occasions to Congress under oath. So when we look at the idea of impeachment, it's basically, technically, they tend to like to go under these other high crimes and misdemeanors, because the term technically is very vague, and and it isn't very specific. And they can basically make up almost any point of what actually that considers. And most of these points would be something that a president could not technically be arrested for at the time, because of the way investigations go for sitting presidents. So it would be something that would actually, in most cases, a lot of these things are not even arrestable offenses to begin with, as we see in a lot of these impeachment trials to begin with when it comes down to it. Most of them are based on essentially non-crimes to begin with, because they're basically based on these ideas of political partisanship to essentially go after people, when there's actually, if you had real issues with it, they're not usually brought up, because they would take down both party people, and that's not usually likely to happen. Such as if we look at the case of the President Clinton impeachment, there were issues that they could have brought up on Clinton, but essentially it would have ensnared people on the establishment part of the Republican Party, and they surely were not going to do that, because that would essentially been counterproductive. And when we look at the way the Constitution is structured with it, is basically the one problem we see right here is on the duties of the president. The president basically is meant to, the whole thing is meant to basically follow the Constitution. They're meant to only execute the laws. And the problem being is what's happening is we're basically having presidents that are not only executing, they're thinking that they could basically, in the case of where they feel that production is not happening from the legislature, that they can change it not only to execute but to legislate when the execution is not happening. And they tend to use very, very vague executive orders from the past, and they'll state, okay, we think that because they were able to use military constructions, which refer to such things as it can be a base, it could be a barracks, it could be an armory, and any of these other things like that. And what they do is they go, okay, we see these things under there, and these were allowed under a certain executive order under President Reagan. Okay, so we're going to change that around, and we're going to say that we're going to consider the border fence under that. Well, if we look at actually where the border fence is actually funded, it doesn't go under the Department of Defense. It goes under a completely different department. It's viewed as national security, which is not defense. Department of Defense is completely different. When we look at the actual people who lead the departments, the actual heads of those departments aren't even the same people. They aren't even the same gender. Nielsen is a female who actually leads the proper department for actually what would be Homeland Security, which is the actual proper department. Homeland Security is what is actually the bill that would actually take care of a border wall. This is the one you actually need to address for funding, the $5 billion. Now, you can take it up with however you want to fund it. Now, you can remove a lot of funding from the defense budget, and it would be very, very easy. Now, it doesn't take much time to do this. What you need to do is you need to essentially reverse course on a lot of your decisions for what you do in foreign policy. And this is what a president needs to do. They should probably read up on what the founders' foreign policy was. And it wasn't to get, number one, we didn't have any entangling alliances. That's number one. Number two is we weren't in any of these entrenched in wars constantly overseas. So this is not what happened with our founders. And if you take that to heart, what's going to happen is you're going to realize our defense budget is going to be about a third of what it really is. This means you can take all that extra money and you can either A, put it toward other things, or B, you can put it toward paying down the debt. This means you're going to have more than enough. And then when it comes down to what we're paying at other countries' walls, you can make the case that we don't need to put any money into foreign aid, because they're saying if you're against a wall here domestically, you should surely be against the wall in other countries. This is why you need to make the argument on facts, and a president surely should be able to make that case. He doesn't need to go to the idea of these executive orders. Most often, an executive order is only to define current and existing law. That's its sole purpose. And it's not the number of executive orders you make, it's the content of the executive order itself. Which is why the idea to go against this current executive order is very, very intelligent for the ones that are, for the Republicans that are going against it. Now, I wouldn't say as much for the Democrats that are going against it, because when we view them, where a lot of them are just doing this based on their idea of oppose anything Trump does, and that's what's really happening. But when you look at executive orders on a whole, of what has happened with the executive is most of them have not understood that it's meant just to define current and existing law, because it's essentially has been vague with the way it's been written from Congress. So when Congress does not become very specific, the executive must essentially define that law. And that's where we get the executive coming in there and defining it. And that's why we have those things. Now executives wouldn't have to do as much if the legislature would actually be a lot better at defining law and actually being a lot more specific when they write these laws. But since they'd rather have these bureaucrats do all their work and write these very, very vague laws, we get these problems like that, and it leaves a lot of things open-ended. And that's basically about it when it comes down to the idea of what the president should be doing. And when it comes down to it is we should have all of them, when they take these oaths, to actually take them seriously and actually look at the Constitution before they run. If they cannot uphold the actual Constitution as written, and as written in a very direct manner, and they feel that the Constitution needs to be changed, they feel they should actually be going and becoming an activist and not an actual leader. Now, if you like this, like, subscribe, click the notification bell, share it all the way on social media. Make sure that you subscribe, or you get your friends to subscribe as well, I should say. And make sure that you check out my Patreon page, as well as see if you can get other people to check out my Patreon page. And that's about it. Bye, everyone.